We go. And we're recording.
Good morning, everybody. Oh, afternoon, 1:30. That's right. It's afternoon here in New Zealand. Right. As people are joining, I think we still got some people in the queue joining here, but I just thought I'd take this opportunity to introduce our new staff member, Gabrielle, who's on the call. So she just joined us. What's it been? A couple of weeks now? Yeah. Um, Right, standard housekeeping for our webinars is we are recording, so anyone who registered and hasn't attended will get a copy of the recording, hopefully by the end of the week. I've got a few things to finish before the end of the week, but hopefully I get that turned around. Otherwise, I'll get it out in the early part of next week. We also have, you'll see across the top bar, there'll be a little Q&A, so you can jump in there and ask any questions as we're going through the content. We've got the team here, so Gabrielle and America, that can jump in and try and answer any of those questions, and maybe we could pick them up at the end as well, and we'll talk through them. Okay, so that's the benefit of joining live is you get to ask the questions. Everyone else will just get the recordings, so they could look forward to that. And there's a delay before I post it on YouTube, so yeah, make the most of having this live session and ask as many questions as you got. Right, the topics for today. So this is sharing best practices in across Microsoft 365, so across the whole spectrum. It's a massive topic, so we're not going to cover everything, but what I wanted to do is cover some of the highlight areas. So I need to set like the foundational framework around how the permissions are actually architectured inside of SharePoint and Teams and OneDrive and all the other aspects. Then we'll jump into the sharing links and all the options within the sharing links, how to share correctly, and then the risk of oversharing. And then we'll have a look at applying policies and what we call cloud governance. And then we've got the section at the end for the Q&A. Okay, let's jump in because got a lot of content to cover. Right, so this is one of those things. It's always about finding that balance between kind of security and productivity. So the more secure you are, it kind of gets a little bit tricky for people to manage, become productive. So the nature is to try and make things open access. And actually, by default, SharePoint actually allows kind of anonymous sharing and open sharing to public if you create sharing links. So by default, it is kind of that open access. And then from an IT security perspective, we want to try and like dial that up on the security side, which actually makes it slightly harder to work with and a little less productive. So you got to find that right balance. But what we look at here is in that open access, obviously the risk is you're too exposed and you have a lack of oversight. So as a company, you kind of lose control over who has access to your data and all of your documents. The flip side of that is obviously turning on all the security settings and blocking the external sharing. Might sound like a good idea, but we see it all the time that what actually happens is that your users actually just find workarounds. So they create Google Drives and Dropboxes and things like that. And ultimately, by them creating another way of sharing, the company has lost control anyway. So for all that work of deploying all the security settings, you actually lose all the security because they've just gone and used something else. So, like I say, we hear it all the time. People say to us, "Oh, we got SharePoint, but we can't share out of it, so we have Dropbox." And it's like, the clue is in the name, guys. It's SharePoint, so you can share from SharePoint, and it's only blocked because IT has blocked it, which technically is kind of sometimes the right thing to do. But what we want to do is try and find that balance so that there's somewhere along that line where you have enough security in place, but you have some freedoms to actually be productive and collaborate. So what is that? That's what we're going to try and figure out. When we look at permissions architecture, if you look at an entire tenant, so you have a number of SharePoint sites. Some SharePoint sites have a single document library and folders and files. Some SharePoint sites have multiple document libraries, folders, and files. And every team that you create in Microsoft Teams also creates a SharePoint site. So you actually have this structure where you have files that can be shared from many different locations. And every single one of those levels has permissions. So we could define the permissions at the tenant level. So that's kind of like your baseline permissions of whether as a tenant you will allow external sharing or not. Then you can set the permissions at the site level. So you can say whether at a tenant level you will allow sharing, but you're going to block some of these more sensitive sites. So you block it at a site level. You could also block it at document library level. So if you break your site up into multiple libraries, you could then have permissions on a library. But you can also have permissions on a folder, and you can have permissions on a file. So you can imagine with hundreds of thousands of files, if you had unique permissions on every single one of them, it's going to be like absolute chaos to manage and figure out who has access to what. So our best practice is that we set the permissions at a tenant level and at a site level. That way you have visibility of any member who has access to the site should have access to all of the content within the site. So that's our kind of go-to normal. But of course, every scenario maybe has a different needs case. And so sometimes it becomes, a good use case to say, okay, well, let's split the libraries up and do different permissions on the libraries. We've kind of feel once you get to the folder level, you've gone a bit too granular on assigning those permissions, but it happens all the time. So there are some use cases, and we'll touch on those later. So hopefully that gives you some idea. So you've got tenant, site, document library, folders, and files. In the tenant settings, so in the back end, we get access to this screen here. So we can dial up and be most permissive, which is the default out of the box. So what that means is that anyone in your organization can share a link to files and folders to anyone outside of your organization, and they don't require sign-in. So this is what we call anonymous sharing links. So that means that anyone with the link in the world, if they have access to the link and they click the link, they'll be able to open your documents and your folders if it's shared through a folder link. So obviously that's the biggest exposure. There are sometimes some use cases where that's applicable. Quite commonly, any organization that works with a council, so if you're like an architecture firm or something like that, you have to work with a council. You don't know who the recipients are, so you have to then share an anonymous link, which is giving you some exposure, but there's some things we could do to kind of limit that a little bit. The next option, you've got new and existing guests, and you also have existing guests. So the difference between those is that you actually have to name the user that you're going to share with. So you would have to put the person's email address in. They will receive an email to say, you now have been granted access to this resource, file or folder. When they go through and click the link, they would have to authenticate. So it's a little bit of a challenge. And we do get some people saying, well, this is too difficult. But really all it is they have to authenticate with their email, which pings them a code back to their email, which then they plug back in again to validate that it's them. If you have MFA turned on your tenant, they will also be prompted to set up MFA, which is a little bit of a challenge. But nearly every single application we work with these days has MFA, so it shouldn't be too much of a challenge. It just looks a little bit weird because they're using MFA to get to your tenant and your content. But anyway, that's a good halfway house. The difference between new and existing and just existing is that new and existing allows your staff to add new guests. So all they have to do is put the email address in and it will actually create a guest account. If you just use existing guests, then they have to already exist within the tenant. And then you can have a process that IT can actually control the onboarding of guests before you're allowed to share the content. So it kind of puts a little bit of an approval step in there. Then the most restricted is that you can only create sharing links with people inside your organization. So that might be too restricted for what you need, but in an ideal world, that's what we dial it down to unless you tell us otherwise. But this creates a conundrum. So we call it the sharing conundrum. But imagine here you've got the tenant settings on the left, and then you have a series of sites. So by default, if we set it that anyone, you can create anyone links as anonymous across the world. We think, okay, well, we'll try and dial that down. So you dial it down to organization only, and it will dial it down for all of the sites within your tenant. Then what we get asked is, oh, hang on, actually, site 2, we want to actually share that one externally. So then we want to dial it up. But you can't do that because the tenant settings are dialed down to organization only. So then what we have to do is actually dial the entire tenant up to make it available, which then increases all of your sites to that top level. And then we dial down all of the other sites except for site 2. So while that works in this scenario, because you tell us, like today, I just want site 2 to be externally shared. So we could do all that. We could dial everything down. But what happens when someone adds a new site? So one of your team creates Teams or they create a SharePoint site, it will inherit the default permissions from the tenant. And therefore, it will have the ability to externally share, which is maybe not what you want. So then we would have to remember to go in and any new site that gets created, dial it back down again. So that's the challenge we've got with managing permissions across multiple sites. The solution to that, of course, is obviously site owner training to make sure that anyone creating sites has the knowledge to say whether it is or isn't externally shared. But we can also implement provisioning templates. So you can't just have the free will to create sites. You have to go through an approval process, and through that provisioning, we can apply a template which defines the rules as to whether it can or can't be shared externally. But you also have to remember it's not just when this team is created, because anyone can dial those settings up and down within the site. So if you really want to lock it down, you actually need to apply a policy to say that only site 2 is the one that could be externally shared. If anyone modifies any of the other sites to allow external sharing, and you want to block that, then it will automatically to return it back unless you put it on the exclusions list. So site 2 would be an exclusion, and you would have to say site 3 can also go on the exclusion. So you could put some policies in place. So this is all part of what we call cloud governance. So it's just managing that workspace infrastructure. Right, sharing links. So there's really two reasons why most people create sharing links. One is to quickly give someone, a link to the file. They already have access, but you're just saying, hey, that document that you're working on, it's here. We need to work on this now. So they already have access. You're just giving them a quick link to find it again. The other one is actually you want to change the permissions. You want to grant new permissions to people. So that would be in a more of a collaborative space. So you want to externally share to a client. You're giving them permissions into that. So if you think about those two parts, we want to give someone a quick link, but we also want to change the permissions. Sometimes you're not changing the permissions. You're just doing a quick link. The idea is you just need to be intentional. And most people that I see just use the defaults. So they create a sharing link and send it off to somebody without looking at the settings. So we're going to jump into that. Right. In this example, I'm just going to show sharing a file from a library. There's lots of places that you can share files from, and I'll show you some others, but right now I'm just going to talk about how you do it from a library. So you can select the document, and then here we're looking at the benefits for video document, which is a Word document. And when you select it across the menu at the top, you could choose share. Otherwise, there's a little icon on the document row itself where you can click share. That then pops up this little window. So you can share. So you can see from in there that you can add someone's email address. And there's a little pencil icon, which I'll show you shortly. But that little email address that's essentially where you can or can't determine whether you add an external user. So depending on those settings that we set at a tenant and site level, depends on whether you can add an external person's email address or just an internal person's email address. But the important bit that nobody ever does, and Microsoft kind of hide it away a little bit, but you really need to be clicking on that cog at the bottom. And you need to be having a look at that and seeing what the settings are. So when you click that, it opens up another panel, which has essentially 4 options, but you have the anyone. So that's an anonymous sharing link. Sometimes that's your default. So you really need to be careful that when people are creating these links, if that is your default, then you are most exposed. And we quite often see a lot of our clients, maybe, the first time we run our auditing tools, they might have hundreds of thousands of links because every time they share a document, they're creating anonymous sharing links. So yeah, really, really dangerous, those sharing links. Then you've got the next option, which is people within Custom 365. And I'll step through the others, but I'll just show you the differences between the two. So that anyone sharing links, of course, you're sharing this to anyone outside of your organization. It is really best practice if you're going to do that, that you set a password and share the password separately to your recipients to make sure that there is some control over who has access to those documents. But I do get it that it is a challenge. So it's that balance between security and productivity. But if you are going to anonymously share, especially if it's something that's potentially sensitive, you really should put a password in there. And we like to see that you put an expiry date so that that link eventually will expire. Just run through these options here. So you can actually change whether you can edit or view or download. So you can block downloading of a document as well. Because this is a Word document that we've shared, you actually get this other special one, which is called Can Review, which is a really cool feature, because that means if anyone uses track changes within a Word document, what it actually is someone can suggest a change in the document, but they can't commit the change in the document. So that's a really cool little feature there. So you could give people review access, they could comment on the document, they can add some suggested changes, and then the owner of the document can then go through and approve or decline those changes. So that's a really cool feature. Just a little side note. Of course, really, again, you just want to be intentional whether you are going to allow people to edit or whether you only want them to view. So that just depends on whether it's collaborative or you're just sharing information. So just pay attention to those. Right. The next one is the one that I actually prefer that everybody uses, which is the green. So I've colored it in green, but this is the only people with existing access. So if you're just sending someone a quick link and saying, hey, here's that document I was talking about that we need to work on, you just send them the link with the only people with existing access, and then they can access the document because you're not actually changing the permissions. You're not trying to grant new permissions into that document. So that's a really good one to use, and I would like to see that being used as the default across every organization. The other option is people you choose. So a little bit like the ability to externally share, but you actually need to define their email address, and they have to authenticate through their email. So that's the four options there. Inside of a Word document, you can also share. So in the top right of a document, you can drop down a little share menu, and there's a little share icon, which actually sends you to exactly the same screens. When you're in an email and you go to attach a document, it will ask whether you want to attach it as a copy or create a sharing link. Now, the interesting part, I always used to say, just create a sharing link because then you're creating that collaboration. But of course, there are quite often some use cases where you actually do genuinely just want to give them a copy. So if you're just sending it for their own use case, then you just send them a copy of the document. What I would definitely encourage you is if you have company policies, this comes down to that having a single source of truth, that you should never send a policy via an attachment. Because what you want is you don't want all of your staff to have their own copy of a policy or a procedure manual or any of those other controlled documents. You want to send them a link to the document that when they click it, even if they clicked it in 3 years' time, they'd click the link and they'll see the latest version of the document, not the one that you sent them 3 years ago. So that's kind of like the differentiator for me is if I'm going to continue to modify the document, then I want to create a sharing link. If I just want to give them a copy of the document as it is currently, then I might attach it as a copy. And then I can externally share that without having to do the permissions and the setup as a guest user. Okay, when you share a file as a link, though, what it actually does is it puts it in text within the body of the email. So a little hyperlink. You could click that and then click Manage Access, and then you can configure the settings. So slightly different to the experience through SharePoint, but you can configure those settings. And you'll notice that this has a different setting, which is recipients of this message. So that's really cool because you could put people in the to by their email address, and that's effectively giving all of those people access into that document. So that's quite a neat little feature, but you are bringing them in as guests by adding them in as a recipient of the message. So you just got to bear that in mind. Again, there is my favorite one, which is the only people with existing access. So if they are already, let's say you created a team site and you've already invited them as a guest to the team site, you could then share the document. They already have access. You're not needing to grant them new access. Okay, Teams chats is another interesting one. So you'll see here that by default, and I suggest you go and try this for yourself, but next time you upload a document, and this might be from one SharePoint site or another Teams site into a different Teams chat or a different Teams channel post. But you'll see there's a in small print along the bottom that it actually says that people in this chat can edit this document. So again, a little bit like the email, but you are granting now permissions to that document to anybody in that chat. So again, you could click that and you can change the settings. And in an ideal world, you would change the settings to only people with existing access. Otherwise, it can be a little bit dangerous as to where you have shared content into different channels and chats. And it's a similar experience for Teams channels. And here it's referencing that the entire leadership team now will have edit rights to that document. So just bear that in mind. Okay, so how do you know who actually has access? There is, in lots of places, you would have seen it as we step through some of those screens, but you could go into a file and select Manage Access. From the sharing screen, there's these little people icons at the bottom, and you can click that. And when you click into that and see the Manage Access, it actually opens up another panel, and it will list all of the people that have access, all of your groups that have access, and any special links that you have created to share. So in this one, it's nice, clean, and tidy because it's not been shared other than the 4 groups that have access to the SharePoint site. However, In this example, we have shared it with two special people that have edit access, and we have created two sharing links. So you can see this one here is the anyone sharing link. So that's the anonymous sharing. So anyone in the world who happens to find that link would be able to click it. And then the people that we have specified. And you can see who has registered as a guest or an internal person and whether they have access via that link. So if you want to clean these up, you need to come in here and actually use this recycle bin to like delete these links. And that way you then can start taking control of your file sharing again. Right. There is an alternative option though, which is the copy link instead of creating sharing links. So the copy link is very similar to actually creating sharing link, but it's just the next button in the menu. So from the document itself, you choose copy link, and from the menu, you've got the share. Next to that, you've got the copy link. If you use that, then by default, it will say that it's only for the people with existing access. So now you are actually just creating that quick link to the document instead of creating a new permissions link, granting people new access. So that's kind of my go-to preference if you really wanted to create a quick link quickly. You can, of course, change that copy link into another one, which actually creates a different permissions. And that will then actually create a sharing link in the Manage Access panel. But yeah, that's an okay. For me, that's a good compromise. I actually think the safest way to share is using the file path. So if you are in the document and you want to send one of your team to where the document is located, you can go to the info panel and then click copy path. Or from SharePoint, you can click on the little information pane, the more details, and then copy the path from there. Now that's a static path. So that's like on the server where you would have had a folder path. You could copy that and share it to people. If they click it, it will open up the location and open up the document. So you're not changing the permissions at all. You're just telling them where it is. And of course, the downside to that is if you move where it is, now the link won't work. So there's always a bit of give and take on what's the right approach. Right. Okay. So we get it all the time that clients are like, we want to be able to externally share. So if you are, then we've just got some ideas that you might want to look at implementing. So one is to create an externally shared site. So where all of the others are dialed down, you can't share, you create one, which might be like a client's site. So you might create a client site and have all of your files in there and you can share them out. I like that idea because that's making your staff intentionally say, I'm going to take my working document and I'm going to put it into that other site, and now the client has access to it. So it's kind of like that conscious decision. Whereas the risk if you hide it away into another folder somewhere else, people might forget, they might put some sensitive information into the document folders, and now your client has access to things that you never intended them to have access. So I quite like the idea about making that intention to say, okay, I've taken a file here and I'm going to move it over here. The other option is to create a library. So you might have a project's site and you might have multiple libraries, and you might say one of them is the one that is shared with the client. So that's a possibility. That's kind of similar that if you're using Teams, you might have a shared channel, which essentially is like a subsite of your primary site. So that shared channel can have different permissions as well. And then worst case scenario, but it's still kind of okay. It's on the borderline for us. But let's say you had a projects folder, and in the folder you wanted to create a client's folder and share that with the client. So we do have some people that do this. I would make it really obvious that that's the one that is shared externally. So we have the nice colored folders. So I like to make them red, and I like to put the words external on that folder. So then it should hopefully be really obvious if someone is moving a document into that folder that it is actually externally shared. So just a couple of ideas. Like there's no right or wrong way of doing it. It's just sometimes there's better ways of doing things, and that's the kind of ideas we've come up with. Right. Now, you can imagine you have hundreds of thousands of documents, hundreds of thousands of potential sharing links. So how do you actually get visibility? Because nobody is going to click through every single file and figure out who has access to which. So that's where our reporting comes in. So we have, under our cloud governance services, we have reports that can grant you some visibility and oversight over your entire company sharing links. So you can see from here, that this organization has 36 anonymous sharing links, and I could click on that and open, and I can see which all of those files are. If there was one that was potentially sensitive, then I would disable the sharing link and stop the world from accessing it. And the same for the specific links. So I could drill into those 17 links that are shared with specific people and their external people, and I can see who those external people are, what they have access to, whether they've even logged in, and whether they've accessed the files that I've shared with them. And if they haven't, then I can boot them out. If they have, then I do some kind of clean up to make sure they only have access to the things that I'm willing for them to have access to. And the organization links are the ones that have been shared with the entire company. Now, just a little note on how they work. I appreciate I'm running out of time, but those ones, they don't actually immediately grant the entire organization access. What that actually means is if you share an organization link, anyone in the company can click the link. And when they click it, then it grants them access. So you just got to be a little bit careful of the wording there. So it doesn't immediately give everyone access, but if they have the link, they can click it and get access. So those are also ones that we kind of want to review, because I have seen it when we've done some audits that some of our clients have created org sharing links of their HR files. They've shared it to a manager. Now, while it's an email to a manager or a chat message to a manager, then that's probably okay because you're granting the manager access. But what if that conversation in the email has a bit backwards and forwards and, this and that, and then the manager sends it to a staff member and says, what do you think about this? Not realizing that, 20 emails down in the chain, there is a link. And if that staff member finds it and they click it, now they grant themselves access. So there is a huge element of risk with those ones. So we want to keep those clean and tidy. But you can use them in certain use cases. So again, you want to click those and just see which ones are being created. You can see in the other screen that you can actually just select all. So the beauty of this reporting tool, you can select all and just set an expiry date, or actually just block them, remove the access entirely. And that just means that you can start for fresh and start building your links again properly. So that's our tooling for that. One note on Copilot, there's a little bit of a myth going around that Copilot is going to now expose all of this information to people, that once you get a Copilot license, you'll be able to search for your boss's salary. So Copilot itself doesn't give you any more access or any more permissions to the files that you didn't already have. But what it certainly does is it exposes the documents that you did have permission to that maybe you shouldn't have. So it's actually, Copilot is not the problem. The problem was information management on your tenant anyway in the first place. But Copilot is certainly exposing that a little bit more. So we're always saying every time someone's considering deploying Copilot that we run some audits to see who has access to what, whether there's some kind of information management issues that you've got oversharing, and we clean those up before the Copilot licenses get deployed. So that's the only kind of comment I have on that, but it's not Copilot that's a problem. It's your sharing of your documents that's the problem. Right. So a couple of weeks back, we created a cloud governance self-assessment. So if you're worried about your sharing links, and if you go and have a look at how your sharing links are defaulted on your tenant and you had some concerns about that, then that's obviously something we could take a look at. But there's some other things as well. So under cloud governance, like the sharing link management is just a small part of it. There's about 1,000 features really, but this is a self-assessment which you're more than happy to jump in and take. It's just free, and it essentially gives you a score based on 6 categories. And those 6 categories are workspace inventory, workspace lifecycle, provisioning control. So that's what we talked about earlier about creating the ability to create sites with some controls parameters. We've got external guest management, access control. So who has access to what across your tenant. And I can't remember the last one. Sensitive data, which we haven't actually talked about in this session. We'll save that for another webinar, but sensitive data management is another hot topic as well. But by all means, grab that QR, fill in there, see what your score is. I'm very interested to see what kind of responses we get through that. And then we can start doing some baseline metrics as well, which would be really interesting. And then that's there as well. Once you've done that self-assessment, then we can jump on a call and we can run through any concerns that you have. We can talk about how we can improve your scores going forward. This is the last webinar for the year, so we'll be putting our agenda up for next year. We're open to some ideas. If people have some topics they want us to delve into next year, then feel free to fire them through. We can take a look at that and come up with our agenda. Otherwise, we haven't really planned those out yet, so I'll be doing that over that Christmas break. And just a reminder, you should have seen it in our newsletter, but our offices are going to be closed between the Friday, the 20th of December, and Monday, the 20th of January. Over that period, I will be dealing with anything urgent. So if you have any urgent queries, then fire them through to me, but mark the subject line as urgent, so I actually jump in and read it. But otherwise, we'll be heading into Christmas, so that's kind of us. Right. Anamrika, anything on the Q&As?
No questions that have come through. Some great material covered in there, so I'm sure people will be absorbing what you've come through. Do go in and have a look at that self-assessment tool and see how well you as an organisation do. If nothing else, you get another look at Ian holding up that phone. I think that's such an awesome photo. Um, I wish you all a very Merry Christmas. I know it's a little bit early to be saying that, but given it is the last webinar, some of you may not see. So have a wonderful summer break with your people that are important to you.
Yep. Okay. Thanks very much. It's 2 o'clock. I will stop the recording and we'll share the link out, hopefully, like I said, by the end of the week. But thanks very much for joining. Hopefully, you got some value from it.
Thank you all.